Hello, my name is Marjorie Hayes. I'm 72. I bake too much, talk too little. And last Saturday I made an apple pie no one touched. Just as I was setting the table, my son looked me in the eye and said, "You don't need to come tonight, Mom." He didn't shout. He didn't slam a door. But he might as well have, because the next thing he said was, "This place isn't for useless old people." If you think that kind of quiet cruelty doesn't hurt, just wait until you hear the rest. "You don't need to come tonight, Mum." The cinnamon was still warm in the air when the sentence landed. It floated uninvited through the amber kitchen light, slid between the smell of browning butter and sliced apples, and settled somewhere near the faded rug by the stove. Marjorie stood with the oven mitt still in her right hand, her left reaching instinctively to adjust the dial, though the pie was already done. The crust had blistered just right, golden flaky, gently cracked at the seams, where the sugared filling begged to escape. She didn't speak. The air had already spoken enough. The afternoon had been a slow ritual. She had peeled the last of the apples from the backyard tree, his tree, Leonard's tree. The apples were smaller now, spotted but sweet enough when cored right. She'd sliced them thin, layered them carefully, and added her secret, a single drop of orange extract. The crust had been temperamental, but she'd rolled it thinner this time, less flour. And now the pie sat perfect, steaming slightly, a small reward waiting to be shared. Nathan stood in the doorway of the kitchen, not quite inside, not quite gone. He wore the sweater she'd bought him last Christmas, the one with the stitched cuffs he'd said were a bit much. His hands were tucked in his pockets, his jaw moving slightly like there was more he wanted to say but didn't trust the shape of it. "It's just... Emily's boss is coming. She's nervous. You know how she gets." He laughed, soft and apologetic, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I told her we'd keep it low-key." Marjorie looked down at the pie, then at the wine bottle resting by the door. It had dust on it. She had forgotten to wipe it. "I understand," she said, though she wasn't sure if she did. Nathan hesitated. "It's not that we don't want you there, it's just..." And then he said it. "This place isn't for useless old people." The words fell like a drawer slamming shut. His face changed immediately. "I didn't mean..." But it was already said. She didn't tremble. She didn't ask why. She didn't even blink. She just put the pie away. The sound of the oven door was gentler than expected. She wrapped the pie loosely in foil, placed it atop the still warm stovetop, and wiped the counter with a cloth that no longer soaked much. Nathan was still in the doorway, or maybe not. She didn't turn to check. The kettle whistled, once then stopped. When the door finally closed, it didn't slam. It sighed. She rinsed the pie cutter, dried it slowly, and placed it back in its drawer, edge down. Outside, the leaves danced in place, suspended mid-air, as if deciding whether to fall. Marjorie approached the kitchen window, her slippers making a soft whisper across the floor. Across the yard, through the wide dining room window of the main house, the chandelier flickered on. She could make out the silhouette of Emily, moving plates, adjusting flowers, placing the cloth napkins just so. A table was being set, but not for her. Marjorie's hand rested against the cold glass. A thin tremor passed through her fingers, but she held still. Her eyes weren't wet, but they were heavy. Beneath the surface, old memories stirred their shapes, still intact, still sharp. Leonard. It had been years since anyone said his name aloud. She had taken him in when he was barely 10, all knees, and questions left behind by a mother who couldn't choose him. She remembered the first meal she served him: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, 2 forks, because he didn't know which one to use. He had cried when she offered seconds. He had called her Mama Hay. No one else ever did. She blinked once, and the dining room window blurred with the steam of her breath. When the door closed, she looked out the window. The table lights were just being turned on, and she remembered a boy named Leonard once left in her care. "It's just a garage," Nathan once said, "but we made it cozy for you." No one asked if I wanted to leave the main house. The wind rattled the dry leaves against the back wall like they had somewhere better to be. Marjorie pushed the door shut behind her, the click of the latch louder than usual in the stillness. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. One of the bulbs in the corner lamp had gone dim, casting an uneven light across the floorboards. She slipped off her shoes, placing them in the tray beside the narrow door, an old habit she'd brought from the big house. The slippers waiting for her were frayed at the heel, but warm. She shuffled slowly toward the single armchair fingers, grazing the bookshelf as she passed. The titles there hadn't changed in years, gardening poetry, a few old cookbooks with butter-stained pages. It was technically a converted garage. The concrete had been covered in a thin layer of hardwood, and someone had taken the time to hang curtains on the high windows. A small heater hummed by the corner. There was a tea set on the shelf, her mother's porcelain faded roses dancing along the rim. She hadn't used it in months. It felt wrong to drink from something beautiful while sitting somewhere so discarded. On the table near the bed was a photograph in a wooden frame, her and Tom seated on the back porch. His arm looped around her shoulder like a question he never needed to ask. The photo was sun-faded now, his face blurred where the sunlight hit it most days. She reached for the knit shawl draped across the back of the chair and wrapped it around her shoulders. The weight of it was comforting, familiar. Still, it did little against the ache sitting beneath her collarbone. She remembered the day she moved in. It wasn't dramatic. No suitcases. No goodbyes. Nathan had mentioned it like a favor. That way you have your own space, and Emily had nodded, already checking her phone. No one said no. No one said, "You don't have to." No one made her stay. "She likes it back there," Emily had said to someone once. "Quiet, you know." As if silence had been a preference, not a prescription. Marjorie sat slowly, her joints registering protest, and glanced at the low chest of drawers tucked under the narrow window. The middle drawer had a slight bend to it, it always stuck. She hesitated, then reached for it anyway. It opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, neatly folded, was a bundle of old letters. On top, an envelope with Tom's handwriting unmistakable even after all this time. The curve of the M, the short flick on the Y. She ran her thumb along the crease of the envelope. She didn't open it, not yet. Underneath it, folded carefully in legal trifold, was a faded copy of his will. Not the one filed with the lawyer, but the one he'd written first by hand, with notes in the margins. She'd tucked it away after the funeral. There had been no reason to revisit it. Until now. She didn't read it. Not yet. She just held it. And in the silence, a realization settled gently into her. Her exile hadn't been a storm. It had been the quiet closing of doors. Not a scream, but a withdrawal. Not violence, but soft erasure. And she had let it happen. The heater clicked as it turned off. The room fell into a stillness deeper than before. Her gaze drifted toward the shelf above the bed, where an old phone charger hung like a question mark. She reached for her phone. The battery blinked red. Still, she tapped through the contacts. The name was still there. Leonard. She hadn't spoken to him in years. Not since the funeral. Not since he left town. But the number was still there, buried untouched, like a memory in a drawer that stuck but never broke. She stared at the letter, then reached for her phone. Leonard's number was still saved in her contacts. "I wasn't stealing," he said, "just resting." His sweatshirt was torn, his eyes wide with hunger, and something else Hope maybe Marjorie hadn't remembered it in years, not in colour, not this vividly. But tonight, with the letter still warm in her hands, the memory returned, like an old film reel threading itself through her chest. It had been a winter evening, one of those nights when the frost crept along the window panes before dinner was done. She was carrying out the compost when she saw movement at the edge of the yard. Between the apple tree and the back fence, huddled low, a figure crouched no bigger than a scarecrow, really. She'd frozen in place, her eyes adjusting. He didn't run. Instead, he looked up. A boy, maybe 15. Dirt on his cheeks, knuckles raw. A tear along the side of his hoodie revealed a scraped shoulder. His shoes, if they could still be called that, were duct-taped together at the toes. "I wasn't stealing," he said again, slower this time. "Just resting." She didn't ask what he was running from. The desperation in his eyes made that question feel cruel. "Are you hurt?" she'd asked instead. He nodded toward his arm. "I fell. On the tracks, I think. I don't know." The porch light cast long shadows across the yard. The air smelled of cold and leftover rosemary from the roast she'd cooked earlier. Marjorie set the compost bin down, gently walked back into the house, and returned with a plate, 2 sandwiches, a banana, and a soft cookie she'd meant to save for Nathan. She handed it through the fence without a word. He devoured it with the practiced quiet of someone used to being invisible. Later, she led him still without touching, without forcing toward the mudroom. There she opened the cabinet and pulled out an old flannel and a bandage kit. As he cleaned the scrape, she found herself watching his hands. Careful, thin, not yet hardened. "I've got a washer back here. Use it if you like." "I'll bring you something warmer," she said. And she did. Tom's jacket, still hanging in the back closet. Brown corduroy lined with flannel. It had smelled faintly of pine. She hadn't washed it since the funeral. He looked at her before putting it on, as if he knew it carried meaning. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. That night she'd called Coach Mendez, a friend of Tom's, who still volunteered at the youth shelter. "He needs more than a meal," she'd said. "He needs a name on paper. A door." Leonard had left the next day with a slip of paper in his pocket and Tom's jacket on his back. He hadn't looked back, until he did. He stood at the gate again just before dusk. She remembered how the wind played with the collar of the jacket, how his eyes seemed steadier, though no less young. "You saw me," he said, "when I didn't know I existed. That was all." And then he was gone. Back in the present, the heater kicked on with a low hum. Marjorie's hands trembled as she picked up the phone. The letter lay across her lap, but her fingers hovered above the keypad. She hadn't spoken to him in years. Didn't even know if the number still worked. But she found it. Leonard? Still saved. She tapped the call button before she could change her mind. 3 rings. Then a pause. Then his voice. "I was hoping you'd call." The light from their dining room spilled across the lawn like an invitation I never received. Marjorie stirred her tea with a spoon that clinked too loud in the hush of the small kitchen. The window over the sink framed the main house like a stage set, warm lights, glowing shadows dancing softly behind linen curtains. She hadn't meant to look. But the silence of her own space had its own kind of gravity, and the laughter that drifted through the glass felt like a memory knocking. Nathan's silhouette crossed the dining room twice. He was moving plates, she thought. Emily appeared just briefly, arms extended, probably setting a dish in the center of the table. Everything moved in rhythm, like choreography she'd once known the steps to now forgotten. The tea had gone cold. She wrapped her fingers tighter around the mug, more for warmth than comfort. There was a time early on when Emily still called her mom, tentative, polite. When Marjorie had been invited not just to dinner, but to taste test new recipes, to sit near the head of the table, to share stories about Nathan's childhood that made them all laugh. Back then, the table had been round, but over time the shape of things changed. The invitations thinned like the slices of pie that no one asked her to bake anymore. Emily's glances became measured, like weighing whether her presence disrupted a polished picture, especially when guests were over. That was the hardest part, feeling like a smudge on her own family's portrait. A gust of wind swept across the yard, rustling the dry branches of the apple tree. The pie from earlier still sat untouched on the counter behind her. Its cinnamon sugar top, now dull under the kitchen light. Through the window, the dining room glowed brighter. Someone lit candles. She saw the flash of Nathan's smile, his mouth moving as he gestured with a fork. Emily leaned in, laughing at something. For a moment, the sound carried just a hint, a ripple of joy that had nothing to do with her. Then a car pulled up. It was a dark sedan, unfamiliar. The headlights cut a path across the lawn and lit up the fence with sharp angles. Marjorie's hand stilled on her teacup. The door opened. Leonard stepped out. He straightened his jacket, still a little loose in the shoulders, and smoothed the front. He looked older than she remembered, of course, but the same steadiness was in his posture. The same awareness in how he carried himself, like he'd learned long ago to walk softly in places he wasn't sure he belonged. He climbed the porch steps, slowly pausing at the top, for a breath. Maybe two. Then he rang the bell. Marjorie didn't move. She didn't step outside or wave from the window, but her breath caught just slightly in her chest. She held the cup closer to her mouth, though she didn't sip. Her eyes didn't leave the door. Through the distance, through the layers of glass and memory, she watched. Nathan came to the door, opened it, and when he saw who stood there, his face changed. Through the window pane, she saw Nathan open the door and watched his face change when he saw Leonard. "I was told I'd be meeting family tonight," Leonard said, setting down his coat. "Are they not all here?" The room stilled for a fraction of a moment, not long enough to be called silence, but long enough to be noticed. Nathan, standing by the sideboard, shifted slightly as if his weight had betrayed him. Emily looked up from her glass of wine with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh," she said too brightly, "you must be Leonard. I think Nathan mentioned you once, from the scholarship fund." Leonard smiled gently. "Not quite. I was never part of any program. Just a kid behind a fence once hungry and lost." Nathan coughed. "Leonard, please sit. Can I get you something to drink?" The seat they offered was at the far end of the table, close enough to be courteous, far enough to remain separate. The wine in Leonard's glass shimmered under the pendant lights, but he didn't reach for it. The roast sat steaming at the center, surrounded by bowls of vegetables, plates passed with cautious enthusiasm. But something had shifted. The conversation, once fluid, now stumbled like an old engine struggling to start. "I owe a lot to this family," Leonard said, placing his napkin across his lap with care. "To a woman in particular. She once made soup with lentils and rosemary, bandaged a wound I didn't know was bleeding, gave me a coat that still smelled of her husband's cologne." Emily's hand froze on her fork. "Marjorie Hayes," Leonard added gently. Nathan cleared his throat. "Yes, my mother. She's resting tonight." Leonard turned his gaze to Nathan, no accusation, just an observation. "She must be tired, or perhaps just uninvited." Emily tried to laugh. "She prefers her quiet. That's all. She's more comfortable in the guest house these days." "Guest house," Leonard repeated softly. I see. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look around for confirmation. But the room, warm with roasted spices and clinking glasses, now felt suddenly too full, too exposed. I used to think silence was comfort, Leonard said after a pause. But sometimes it's just exile. Emily blinked. Excuse me. He looked at her kindly. I mean, sometimes we assume people choose distance, when really they were never invited close. No one responded. Even the fireplace crackled more quietly, as if unsure of its place in the room. Nathan shifted again, then raised his glass awkwardly. To new connections? Leonard clinked his glass softly against Nathan's, then set it down without drinking. To those who see people, especially when they're made invisible. Outside the window, the wind had calmed. The yard sat in gentle stillness, a veil of autumn leaves covering the grass. In the darkened room at the back of the house, Marjorie stood beside her window. She held her cooled tea in both hands, watching the flicker of candles inside, and knew she'd finally been spoken for without needing to say a word. We brought muffins. From Hazel's, your favourite, right? Nathan's voice was almost too cheerful. Marjorie turned slowly from the window. The light fell in soft angles through the lace curtains, catching the dust in mid-air. Her cardigan, pulled tightly around her shoulders, felt heavier than usual. On the table, 2 cups of coffee and takeaway lids sat like guests, unsure of their welcome. Emily smiled as she removed the lid from the muffin box. Still warm, she said, placing it delicately on the table between them, as though warmth was apology enough. They were almost out, Nathan added, rubbing his hands together. Popular place on Sundays. Marjorie didn't answer immediately. She looked at the muffin's blueberry with crumb topping. Someone had remembered. I see, she said after a beat. You made the effort. Emily leaned forward. About last night. Leonard's visit was unexpected. Was it, Marjorie asked, lifting one brow. Nathan jumped in. He's talking about starting a foundation for displaced youth. Mentioned you. Said you changed his life. Emily nodded quickly. He said it would be wonderful if you were included. Maybe help set it up. Be the face you know of compassion. The word clinked like metal against porcelain. We could do this as a family. Emily continued, her tone growing smoother, more measured. Show unity. Heal things publicly. It's important now with everything Leonard's trying to do. Marjorie picked up one of the muffins, turned it slightly in her hand, then placed it on a porcelain plate. She studied it for a moment. Then, gently, deliberately, she pushed the plate a few inches away from herself. Nathan cleared his throat. Mum, this is a chance. People are watching. Leonard, he's vocal. People might start asking questions. I imagine they already are, Marjorie said quietly. A vibration buzzed softly on the counter. Her phone. A text from Ruby. Call me after. Say nothing you'll regret. She glanced at it, then looked up. Her eyes were clear, unreadable. You didn't come because you wanted me back, she said, her voice even. You came because someone else told you I belonged. Emily flinched slightly. That's not fair. Marjorie's gaze didn't waver. Fairness has never been a requirement here. No one spoke. The heat from the coffee cups faded slowly, leaving a faint ring on the wood. After a while, Marjorie stood, moved to the small kettle, and poured hot water into her own teacup. The scent of chamomile rose with the steam. She carried it back to the table, sat, and wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic. She didn't offer them anything. If Leonard calls me directly, I'll listen. But not for you. I never threw anything away. Not what mattered. Marjorie ran her fingers along the seam. The coat was heavier than she remembered, Tom's old winter one, deep navy wool lined, with the buttons slightly loose from years of use. It still smelled faintly of cedar and wind. She had folded it carefully after Leonard returned it. But today, something pulled her back to it. She laid it across her lap and let her hands glide over the stitching, searching for the past, like one might read Braille across time. Her thumb caught on a rough edge inside the left pocket. Not the pocket Leonard had favoured, he always kept his hands in the right one, but the other. Her fingers slipped in, and there tucked deep in the lining was a folded piece of yellowing paper. She hesitated before opening it. The handwriting was unmistakable Tom's blocky, earnest letters, ink slightly smudged, like it had been written in the middle of thought. Leonard, you remind me of someone I once was, long before I met Marjorie. She saved me from that version of myself. She sees through the noise. She's always known what to keep. If you're wearing this coat, it means you stayed. I'm glad. Take care of her if I can't. Tom Marjorie's hands trembled just slightly as she folded it back. The morning light through the curtains had shifted it, now lay across the chair opposite her, where Tom used to read the paper. She reached for her phone and dialed Ruby. Hey, Ruby answered, breathless. You okay? I found something Marjorie said. In Tom's coat. I want to read it to you. There was a pause, then a softer, go on. She read the letter slowly, her voice low and steady. When she finished, there was a quiet hum from the other end of the line. That letter might be older than some lies, Ruby said finally, but truth doesn't expire. Marjorie let that settle. Outside, the wind whispered along the edge of the house. She felt it in her knees before she heard it in the trees. I'd forgotten how steady his hand was, she said, even when everything else felt unsure. Tom always knew what mattered, Ruby said. So do you. Marjorie looked at the folded letter on the table. The paper was fragile, but the words were firm. What now, she asked, though part of her already knew. Leonard needs to see that letter. So does someone else. Marjorie looked toward the drawer where the copy of the will rested like a quiet weight. If it's not the official one, it doesn't count. Emily's voice echoed in Marjorie's mind. Years later, still crisp. The sentence had been tossed out lightly in that clipped tone she used when she wanted to sound neutral but wasn't. Marjorie had said nothing at the time. She simply folded the napkin on her lap and returned to her tea. Now, in the hush of the midday kitchen, that memory surfaced again as she placed the yellowed envelope gently on the table. The linen cloth beneath it was plain, but ironed something to anchor the moment. The paper crackled faintly as she opened the envelope. The copy wasn't pristine anymore, the corners soft, a slight tear at the fold. But the words were still clear, Tom's signature steady at the bottom of the final page. Marjorie Hayes shall have the right to remain at the property located at 23 Belrose Lane for the duration of her life should she choose to. No one had ever spoken of that line again. A knock sounded at the door. Ruby stepped in scarf still tied around her neck. I brought cinnamon rolls. Thought we'd eat before talking, but... She paused, seeing the envelope on the table. Ah, we're skipping straight to truth. Marjorie gave a tired smile. I think I've had enough sweeteners this week. Ruby sat down, laying her purse gently on the chair. She picked up the paper, scanned the text, and let out a low whistle. Was this ever registered? No. It was Tom's draft. The lawyer said the final was misplaced after the funeral. Misplaced, Ruby repeated, setting the copy down, like how some memories vanish only when convenient. Marjorie looked out the small window above the sink. The leaves had begun to fall more quickly, swept in little circles across the stone path. He handed me this the week before his last hospital stay, she said. Said he wanted me to feel safe. Did you? For a time. Ruby leaned forward. You know this doesn't hold legal weight, but it holds something else. Marjorie nodded. It holds what was meant. There was a buzz. Marjorie's phone lit up. Leonard? Still ready when you are? Ruby saw the screen, then turned back to the table. You said you wouldn't sign anything. I won't, Marjorie replied, but I can still speak. Ruby tapped her fingers lightly. Then let someone else say it for you, with your story. They sat in silence a while. Outside, a wind stirred but didn't howl just enough to move the curtain's edge. Marjorie folded the paper again, slower this time, like wrapping a memory for safekeeping. She reached for the letter Tom had written to Leonard and placed it beside the will copy. Then, almost as an afterthought, she reached for the pie dish on the counter. The apple pie she had made 2 nights ago sat untouched. She ran a fork along the crust. It flaked gently golden and soft. A part of me died with him, but the rest, it isn't done yet. She won't say much, Leonard warned the small audience. But I suggest we listen anyway. The community hall smelled faintly of wood polish and autumn air. Folding chairs circled the center of the room, 3 placed at the front, facing inward. A table with a white cloth held paper cups of cider and napkins dotted with falling leaf prints. Marjorie sat in one of the front chairs, hands clasped a knit shawl draped over her shoulders. She hadn't wanted to come, but Ruby had gently said, "This isn't about speeches, it's about being seen." She had been unseen long enough. Leonard stood beside her, posture straight but warm. His jacket fit well, though Marjorie could still see the boy in him, the one crouched behind the fence all those years ago. This foundation, Leonard said, his voice even was named for a space I used to dream about. A mile of freedom, a mile of grace. I never thought I'd find it in someone's backyard, or in their kitchen. The room was filled with unfamiliar faces, young professionals, social workers, a few elders in cardigans and brooches. Ruby sat to Marjorie's right, hands folded in her lap, offering her presence like an anchor. I was hungry. Literally and otherwise, Leonard continued. And a woman I'd never met looked me in the eyes, gave me soup, and didn't ask why I was behind her fence. A few people smiled. Some glanced toward Marjorie. She said nothing, but nodded once slowly. Ruby leaned forward to speak. The Miles Foundation began as a gesture of gratitude. We aim to honor stories that were never shouted, only whispered. Stories like hers. Marjorie kept her gaze steady. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting a gentle glow. When the event ended, there was no applause. Just movement coats gathered chairs, shuffled. But then, quietly, a woman with snow-white hair approached Marjorie and leaned close. I sat at the back of the room for years, she whispered. Thank you for sitting at the front. Marjorie blinked. Her throat tightened. She nodded again. One by one, others came by, young people with cautious eyes, older ones with quiet reverence. Some shook her hand. One pressed her palm and simply said, "We saw you." She didn't remember standing, but suddenly she was on her feet, heading toward the exit. Outside, the sky was deepening into that blue that comes just before night. She didn't hear footsteps until the girl spoke. "I'm looking for a mentor who doesn't need a microphone. Are you available?" "It was just a photo," Emily said once. But Marjorie remembered the day it was taken, and what was cropped out. The afternoon sun fell in long beams through the high windows of the Miles Foundation's meeting room. On the wall hung modest black and white portraits, some wrinkled with time, others newer, printed fresh, but styled to look vintage. Jada led Marjorie around, gently speaking only when necessary. "These are the origin faces," Jada said, touching the frame of a photo with a soft reverence. "We're building a timeline, Would you happen to have anything old? Marjorie didn't answer right away. Something about the word old caught in her throat, not as insult, but as artifact. She smiled politely, excused herself early, and walked home slower than usual, letting the crisp autumn air settle her thoughts. In the garage apartment, she knelt before the cedar box beneath her bed. Inside were old church bulletins, pressed flowers, Tom's tie with the gravy stain he always denied. At the bottom lay a bundle wrapped in silk paper photographs. One in particular made her pause. It was the Hayes family portrait taken on Nathan's 35th birthday. Tom had been alive, smiling slightly, holding Marjorie's hand, just out of frame. The photo that hung in the main house now was cropped tight, only Nathan, Emily, and the kids. She recalled the conversation like a stain that never washed out. "We're redoing the living room gallery," Emily had said. "More focused images, clean, modern." Nathan had looked at his shoes. "We need to reframe the story." No shadows, Emily had added. Marjorie wasn't mentioned again. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ruby. "Did you keep a copy?" She stared at the photo, ran her thumb across the faded edges. Then she replied, "I have more than the copy. I have the story behind the frame." Back in the kitchen, she brewed tea, letting the steam clear her mind. The picture wasn't proof, but it was memory. That day, Tom had pulled her close before the camera clicked. "You're the frame," he'd whispered. "Everything rests on you." She hadn't understood then how true it would become. That evening, Marjorie slipped the photo into a simple envelope. She added a note, handwritten small but firm. This was the full frame, the full story. Use it carefully. Later at the foundation, Jada opened the envelope and looked at her with wide, grateful eyes. "Where should I place it?" she asked. Marjorie looked around at the wall of faces. She pointed to a lower corner near the window, where light fell gently but didn't draw too much attention. "Put it somewhere not too visible, but not too hidden either." "It'd be good for the kids to see you," Nathan said. And she knew it wasn't about the kids. The invitation had arrived 2 days after the foundation event, neatly worded, handwritten by Emily, though the script was too precise to feel personal. "Thanksgiving dinner," it read. "We'd love to have you." No mention of forgiveness, of reconciliation. Just presence. Marjorie wore the navy blue cardigan Tom once said brought out her eyes. She brought a jar of cranberry chutney, her recipe never published, never asked for. The house was fragrant with spice and polish, the floors shining with preparation. Emily met her at the door with a smile too practiced, Nathan standing just behind, loosening his collar like a nervous usher. The dining room looked like a magazine, spread a long table dressed in ivory linen candles, flickering in low glass holders, a centerpiece of dried oranges and pine cones. The family seats were toward the middle. Marjorie's place had been set at the far end next to the hallway. Her grandchildren greeted her with distracted politeness. One asked if she still made that soup thing, the other forgot her name halfway through a sentence. She didn't mind. It wasn't their fault. Emily floated from guest to guest like a hostess on stage. "This is Marjorie," she said to a man in a crisp blazer. "She's the foundation's origin inspiration. Isn't that wonderful?" The man smiled. "And what does she think about the legacy?" Emily didn't skip a beat. "Oh, she's very proud. She believes in quiet strength." Marjorie sipped her tea, warm and herbal. She'd declined the wine. Silence had more weight when it was chosen. Dinner progressed in layers, roasted turkey, awkward jokes, mentions of company milestones. Nathan introduced the man as Douglas, a senior advisor from his firm. At one point, Douglas leaned closer to Emily. "Funny," he said, nodding toward Marjorie. She reminds me of my grandmother. Also, the quiet kind, the dangerous kind. Marjorie heard. She didn't flinch. She pressed her napkin once to her lips and folded it slowly. The conversation carried on. A toast was raised. Plates scraped gently. No one asked her about the foundation. No one asked her about anything, really. Then her eyes drifted upward to the chandelier aglow and ornate. Just behind it, on the wall above the mantel, hung the family portrait she'd given to Jada. But something was wrong. The image had been framed face in the back, showing instead of the photo. All that could be seen was the cardboard backing and the wire. Marjorie looked up at the chandelier and saw the photograph she'd given had been hung facing the wall. "He left you the house," Ruby said. But maybe that wasn't the most important part. The rain had come softly, barely more than a hush against the roof. A Sunday lull cloaked the world outside in grey light. Inside the small kitchen of the back house, steam curled from the teapot. Marjorie and Ruby sat across from one another, the table between them cluttered with paper's mugs and the weight of things unspoken for too long. "He left you the house," Ruby repeated, tapping the old legal copy gently. But maybe the house was just the frame. Marjorie didn't answer right away. She looked out the fogged window, where the last leaves clung stubbornly to the apple tree. The same tree Tom had planted, the one still giving quietly without applause. "The newspaper called again," Ruby added. "They want a piece on legacy. I told them you'd think about it." "I'll write something," Marjorie said, "but I won't speak. Writing can't be interrupted, can't be talked over." She reached down into the drawer and brought out a folded envelope. The edges had softened with time, the ink slightly faded. It wasn't the letter Tom had meant for Leonard. It was one he'd written just for her the last night, before the silence took him for good. She passed it to Ruby and watched as her friend unfolded it carefully. He said Marjorie whispered not to let anyone else write my part. That silence was for rest, not erasure. They sat quietly as Ruby read. Her lips moved as she did, like she was keeping each word safe. "He wrote, like he knew you'd need," reminding Ruby finally said. Marjorie gave a faint nod. "He did." I didn't know how loud silence could become, until others started filling it with their own version. A message pinged on her phone. "Jada, your words are making people cry. You might be changing more than you know." Marjorie read it without a smile, but something in her shoulders softened. "I don't want to be loud," she said more to herself than to Ruby. "I just want the truth to hum quietly beside someone's grief. Maybe they'll hear it when the house goes still." She turned, pulled a stack of handwritten pages from the counter, her own account not grand, or edited, just steady. In her script were memories not sharpened for effect, but offered like warm bread, broken quiet whole. "He left me the right to remember out loud," she said. "That's enough." There was a pause, not the kind that begged to be filled, but the kind that let things settle where they needed. Then Marjorie rose, reached for the kettle, and topped off both cups with care. The tea glowed faintly amber in the quiet room. "Would you help me scan this? I think it's time someone else read it." The article didn't have her photo, just her words. That made it louder. The morning was unusually still. A breeze nudged the wind chimes, but didn't stir them. Marjorie stood in her kitchenette, carefully steeping a new batch of tea. The scent of mint and something older, maybe memory, drifted through the air. She wore the same grey cardigan from the night Tom passed, not out of mourning, but memory. A light knock at the door. Jada holding a folded newspaper like it was sacred. "They published it," she said, breathless. Page 3. Unsung Voices column. Marjorie raised a brow, but didn't reach for it. Jada unfolded it gently. The text ran in two neat columns beneath a quiet headline, "The Woman Behind the Fence." No byline, no photo, just words. She read aloud. She sat behind the fence but saw through everything. They called her silent, but her silence was a ledger, her absence an indictment. Marjorie didn't move, but her hand around the teacup grew still. A moment later, her phone rang. "Leonard." "You lit a quiet fire, Marjorie," he said. "People are reaching out. Stories are surfacing. Quiet ones. Yours made space." She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Jada looked up, eyes bright. "They know it's you, even if it doesn't say so." Another ping this time, an email. Marjorie opened it slowly. From Emily. "We're considering issuing a clarification regarding the Foundation's origins. You may be named if it helps provide context. Please advise." No greeting, no warmth, just legal coldness wrapped in a silk bow. She closed the email without replying. Later that morning, a tap at the window. An old woman, Mrs. Halverson, from 2 doors down, stood holding a tin of shortbread. "I read it," she said when Marjorie opened the door. "You said what I couldn't 30 years ago. I kept my mouth shut too long. They didn't embrace. They didn't have to." Mrs. Halverson simply placed the tin on the counter and patted Marjorie's hand once before leaving. Jada lingered, turning the paper over in her hands, like it might unfold again into something new. "You changed something," she said. Marjorie shook her head. "I didn't say it to be heard. I said it because silence had become too heavy." As the sun rose higher, light began to pour through the window pane. Marjorie looked up past the curtain's edge toward the building that now housed the Miles Foundation. In the front room, visible through the window, hung the same photo she had once handed to Jada, now properly oriented in its frame. No plaque, no name. But everyone knew. The knock was softer than usual, almost like asking for permission. Marjorie didn't move right away. The sound had barely risen above the creak of the trees outside their branches, bending in the early evening wind. She placed her embroidery hoop down carefully, needle still threaded mid-stitch. The room was as still as the moment before sleep, the kind of quiet that gathers around endings and beginnings alike. She opened the door slowly. Nathan stood there. No bakery bag, no forced smile, no Emily in tow. Just him with his hands at his sides, uncertain. "I wasn't sure if I should," he began. Marjorie stepped aside. "You already knocked." He entered like someone unsure of how to walk on remembered ground. His eyes scanned the room, the old radio, the kettle on its warming plate, the half-finished embroidery of an autumn branch. He noticed the framed photograph on the shelf, Tom Marjorie, and a teenage Leonard standing in front of the apple tree. "I read it," Nathan said finally. "All of it." Marjorie poured tea, though neither of them had asked for it. The scent of cinnamon filled the small space, mingling with the silence. "I recognized the pie," Nathan added, his voice soft. "The one you used to make. Dad always said it tasted like October." She placed a slice of the day-old apple tart on a small plate and handed it to him without a word. He took it, but didn't eat. Just held it like something warm that might still hurt to touch. "I don't know what to say," he said after a long moment. Marjorie looked at him, not with anger, not even sorrow, just clarity. "Then maybe you should listen." He nodded slowly and sat on the edge of the armchair like he didn't belong in it. The ticking of the small clock filled the spaces between them. For a time, neither spoke. There was nothing rehearsed here, no script to follow. Just the raw draft of a mother and a son trying to find where their lines had drifted apart. She didn't bring up Emily. He didn't mention the foundation or the article again. No apology, no attempt to explain it away. But when Nathan finally looked at her, really looked, he didn't look past her, and she held his gaze steady as the hands that had once held his fevered forehead. No forgiveness was offered. None was asked. Just presence. And that, for now, was enough. He stood to leave. Marjorie didn't walk him out. At the door, he paused, glancing once more around the room. His eyes caught the framed photo near the kettle. "I forgot we ever had that framed," he murmured. Then he stepped out into the dusk, closing the door behind him with the softest click, almost like sealing something that shouldn't be disturbed. The new flyers said, "Stories that should have been heard." But Marjorie just called it the quiet table. The community room still smelled faintly of old wood and something sweet like forgotten lavender sachets. Outside, the first warmth of early spring glowed through the glass windows, splashing sun across the worn linoleum floor and the round table at the center of the room. Marjorie arrived early. She always did. She placed a small glass vase filled with fresh violets in the middle of the table, the stems trembling slightly in the breeze from a cracked window. Then, with slow, practiced care, she unfolded a cloth napkin, smoothed it over the center of the table, and laid out a simple tray of teacups and lemon slices. She pinned a tiny brooch, a silver bird, to her sweater. Not for anyone else. Just for her. Soon they trickled in. Mrs. Cortez wrapped in a shawl, too heavy for the weather, her eyes sharp under thinning brows. Vincenzo, who walked like someone carrying invisible suitcases of memory. They didn't rush. No one ever rushed to the quiet table. Jada greeted them with warm nods and her notebook tucked under one arm. She didn't lead the session. No one really did. That was the point. The stories started slowly, like reluctant flowers unfurling. Mrs. Cortez held up a delicate handkerchief embroidered with fading initials. "My husband gave me this the day before he left for the Navy," she said. "I told him it was too pretty to use. He said I should use it only when I needed to remember something soft." Vincenzo chuckled, pulling a crinkled envelope from his coat. "This is the first letter I wrote my wife in Italian before she learned a word of it. She never understood it fully, but she kept it under her pillow for 40 years. They all laughed gently. Not loud, just enough. Jada looked to Marjorie. "Would you like to share today?" Marjorie didn't speak. She only reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden frame. She placed it on the table. The photo inside showed Tom Leonard and a younger Marjorie standing near the old apple tree, the sun slanting just right. She didn't explain. Mrs. Cortez reached out, touched the edge of the frame. "Sometimes silence is how we honor memory," she whispered. The group nodded. The light shifted, brushing across their faces like blessing. Toward the end, a young woman approached, maybe 19, wearing a volunteer badge and nerves. She stood quietly, eyes scanning the table. "Can I sit here next week?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer just to listen. Marjorie looked at her for a long moment. Then she pushed a chair out, slow and deliberate. "There's always room." The new flyers said stories that should have been heard, but Marjorie just called it the quiet table. Sunday afternoon settled over the community center, with a hush that felt deliberate, like the building itself had taken a breath and was waiting. Marjorie arrived early, as she always did now, her canvas bag swinging softly at her side. She moved through the empty room with careful steps, placing her thermos of steeped chamomile on the cloth-covered table and smoothing out the wrinkles in the pale linen. The round table sat in the corner, kissed by the sunlight spilling through the high window panes. A small bouquet of violets stood quietly in the center, trembling slightly from the breeze that sneaked through the frame. Chairs circled like old friends, not too close, not too far. Marjorie adjusted her pin, a small bronze leaf, worn smooth by years of thumb brushing, and placed a stack of napkins beside the teacups. She didn't speak, didn't hum. Her silence was the kind that filled rather than hollowed. The first to arrive was Mrs. Cortez, her silver bun held with a painted comb. "Still don't trust these digital sign-ups," she muttered, setting down a tin of almond cookies. Paper meant permanence. Marjorie smiled and poured tea. Then came Vincenzo with his cane that clicked against the floor and a scarf knotted too tightly around his neck. He took his seat with a small grunt, but nodded toward Marjorie in greeting. No one filled the silence with noise. It was the kind of space where breathing was allowed to be enough. Soon the chairs began to fill. A gentle murmur took hold as conversations, cautious and fragile, unfurled a forgotten birthday story, a love letter buried in a drawer, a napkin doodle from a long-closed diner. Jada entered carrying a clipboard, but not writing. She looked around, then leaned close to Marjorie. "Would you like to share today?" Marjorie shook her head. Then from her bag she drew a small photo frame, nothing ornate, just a faded silver edge and a soft cloth backing. She placed it in the center of the table. Inside was a photograph of her Tom and Leonard standing beside the apple tree, all of them not quite smiling, but somehow full of life. The room shifted. No one said anything at first, but the silence around the image rippled like a stone dropped in still water. Mrs. Cortez reached out not to touch, but just to look more closely. "Sometimes silence is how we honor memory," she whispered. Around them, stories continued. But now every voice was just a little steadier, every laugh a little more certain, every tear a little more sacred. The table held it all. Marjorie didn't need to explain the photograph. The table and the quiet it fostered did all the speaking. Each person who glanced at it understood something personal, something private, and that was enough. She refilled teacups and nodded gently as stories unfolded around her like petals uncurling after a long winter. Vincenzo spoke next, voice slow and thick like honey over old wood. "When my Anna died, I boxed up everything. I didn't want to remember. But then I found her recipe cards. She had notes in the margins, things like, 'Add more cinnamon if sad.'" He chuckled, wiping a tear. "I've been sad a lot. So my biscotti's practically cinnamon sticks now." Laughter scattered lightly around the table, not loud, but real. A woman with trembling hands unfolded a small piece of fabric. "This was my daughter's. She didn't live long. But I carry this. Not because it's all I have left. It's because it's the softest thing that ever touched her cheek." No one tried to fix the pain. They just listened, as Marjorie had silently for years. Only now the silence was offered, not imposed. Across the room, Ruby stood near the community board, pinning up a new notice. At the top, in simple black letters, it read, "She heard us first." Beneath it were short quotes from anonymous elders, snippets of memory, fragments of resilience. Marjorie recognized her own words among them. Not attributed, just there, living. Jada sat beside her again, notebook still closed. "You didn't want to be the face of anything," she said softly. "But I think you became the spine." Marjorie didn't reply. Instead, she offered her a cup of tea, the steam curling between them like breath made visible. Later, as chairs began to scrape gently against the floor, and people lingered in the doorway reluctant to leave, a girl no older than 20 approached the table. Her name tag read, "Sophie, volunteer." She looked down at the chairs at the photo, then at Marjorie. "Can I sit here next week?" she asked. Just to listen, Marjorie met her eyes, then reached to pull out a chair with the ease of one who had done this before. "There's always room," she said. And in that simple gesture, a chair shifted, a space opened, the legacy of quiet resistance, of chosen memory, continued. The garden wasn't hers anymore, but the daffodils still bloomed the way she planted them. The morning air was crisp, the kind that made breath visible for a few seconds before disappearing into the warming light. Marjorie stepped carefully along the edge of the yard, shoes wet with dew. The path that once connected the main house to the vegetable rows now curved around flower beds she had designed decades earlier. She hadn't returned here in so long. She didn't mean to trespass. She just wanted to check if they still grew the way she taught them to. Behind her, the back porch light flicked on. Nathan stood there in his robe, arms crossed, not angry, just present. He didn't call out. She didn't wave. Among the tulips and the overgrown rosemary, the daffodils bloomed in precise lines. Some bent under the weight of early spring rain. Others stood tall, defiant. She smiled faintly. The bulbs had outlived ownership. That was the thing about roots, they remembered where to grow even after names on the mailbox changed. "Are you the flower lady?" The voice was soft, curious. A child's. Marjorie turned to find a little girl watching her from a few steps away, no more than 6 or 7, holding a crayon-stained notebook against her chest. "Excuse me?" Marjorie asked gently. The girl pointed. "You were in the paper. Daddy said you made something called a found something. But I liked the part about the pie. And the flowers." She looked back toward the porch. Nathan hadn't moved. Marjorie bent slowly, her knees creaking as old knees do, and reached for one of the blooms. She pulled a handkerchief from her coat pocket, the one with the stitched edge worn soft from decades of washing, and wrapped the daffodil stem gently inside it. She held it out. "Would you like to keep it?" The child's eyes widened. "Can I?" Marjorie nodded. "It's always been yours? You just didn't know." The girl took the flower like it was made of glass. She didn't run off. She stayed beside Marjorie for a few more breaths, as if trying to memorize the moment. A ping buzzed quietly in Marjorie's coat pocket. A message from Ruby. "Our next session is full. Might need 2 tables this time." She smiled again, this time more to herself. As she turned to leave, she paused near the back wall of the house. The bricks here were older, uneven. Once this corner held a compost bin and a chipped bird bath. Now it held something else, a small stone bench, smoothed at the edges, nestled beneath the eaves. Etched across the top in faint lettering were the words, "Silence is not absence." Marjorie ran her fingers over the engraving. No applause, no parade, just flowers blooming in quiet, and a bench that waited patiently for those who needed to sit. The garden no longer bore her name, yet the flowers still bloomed in her design, defiant, resilient, and unmistakably hers. Marjorie never raised her voice, but her silence dismantled the fiction built around her absence. Justice may arrive late, but it resonates like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody. In a world quick to erase the quiet ones, her presence rewrote the story not through confrontation, but through endurance, memory, and dignity. Sometimes reclaiming a chair at the table starts with refusing to stand back up. Have you ever felt erased from your own story? Share your voice below. Someone is finally listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and follow Heavy Stories for more truths that whisper but never fade.